many people have been to this before? Thanks for coming back. You know, you people inspired me to write this book. I never would have thought of writing a book. I did this for the first time in 22 on Forum Stage 4 over there. And one of the first questions was, have you written a book? And I was like, write a book? And so I kind of got started on it, and I really enjoyed it. And I called it brain candy after a while. It was just so fun to kind of try to learn how to express yourself. And so this year's is a little shorter. I shortened it to about 35 minutes so there'd be more time for Q&A. Because I was running out of time at the end for Q&A. And Q&A is a lot of fun. And there's going to be, the books are up here. They're $49. They're about 62 on Amazon. They're 49 on my website. But then there's a little shipping. But if you don't want to carry one around, you can go to my website. The last slide is going to be a QR code and the name of the website, so you can get to it pretty easily that way.
How about cash?
And a little bit about me. I'm the owner and pilot, but not the builder of Advanced RV4. It's sitting right over there right now. Flew in here yesterday. Now, the fighter pilots of World War II actually inspired me to want to be a pilot. I'm a professional pilot. I work at Phenom 300 and King Air 350. And the fighter pilots of World War II have pretty much been my greatest inspiration for my whole life, and I've been studying them and their tactics for about 45 years. We're going to pass a little bit along with that along to you. So if we got questions, again, we'll do the Q&A at the end. And let me just start by saying that in the 6 years from 1939 to 1945, fighters met each other in combat thousands of times. Now that's a huge subject to cover, even in an hour. In fact, I left so much information on the cutting room floor just to try to fit it into an hour that it took 120,000 words to get it all into the book. But at any rate, so I'm just going to hit the basics. And we can't talk about anti-bomber tactics, maybe in the Q&A, but in here I'm not going to talk about anti-bomber tactics or air-to-ground or night fighter ops. This will just be day fighter versus fighter combat. So let's start with a basic question. Why was the P-51 such a dominant fighter in 1944 and 45 during approximately the final 18 months of the war? It's the same reason the Messerschmitt 109 was dominant in the first 3 years of the war, 39 to 42. They were both the fastest fighters with the most well-trained and effective fighter pilots in their era. The keys to success in World War II fighter combat were fast fighter planes with plenty of firepower, and skilled fighter pilots who could effectively use that speed and firepower. So why speed and firepower and not maneuverability? You know, there seems to be kind of a modern concept of World War II fighter combat that mostly involves swirling dogfights and people in these epic struggles to outmaneuver their foe. But fun fact, no. In fact, as it turns out, the hit and run surprise attack from behind was the most effective and preferred method of shooting down another fighter from the beginning to the end of the war. It was just the safest and easiest way to get the job done. And you know, when you're in combat, you want to do things as safely as you can and as easily as you can. So it's just very effective. And as we shall see when we get into the gunnery section, it was extremely difficult to hit another fighter with your guns, especially if it was maneuvering. So if it was sitting still, that's the key. And that's going to be one of the things that's kind of groundbreaking about the book. There's more detail about fighter gunnery in this book than anything that's been published since World War II, to the best of my knowledge. And I do a lot of reading. But as a result, the vast majority of fighters lost in World War II fighter combat were shot down by other fighters in surprise attacks from behind. It's been estimated that 4 out of 5 victims, fully 80%, discovered the attack either too late or not at all. And here's the fundamental reason why speed prevailed over maneuverability. In order to use your superior maneuverability, if you had that, you had to get close enough to be within the turn radius capability of your opponent. Typical turn radius of a World War II fighter ranged between about 500 and 1,500 feet. Typical firing distance was also about 500 to 1,500 feet. Now that meant in order to use your guns, you had to get close enough to be near the turning radius capability of your opponent. Fighters with higher maximum speed capability were better at keeping their opponent out of guns range and thus too far away to use any superior maneuverability that they may have. Now, it's a pretty well-known fact that during the course of the war, fighters kept getting faster and faster. These here are some of the fastest fighters that were in large-scale production from 39 to 45. And note that there's a nearly 100 mile per hour increase from the beginning to the end of the war, just in propeller-driven fighters. And note also the almost total dominance of German fighters for the first 3 years of the war. Maximum level flight speed was the prime design specification for almost every fighter that flew in World War II. Now, you did not need to have the fastest fighter in the world in order to get the upper hand. You just had to have more speed than your local enemy. And a good example of this is in the Pacific, the dominance of the Corsair Hellcat and P-38 over highly maneuverable but significantly slower fighters like the Zero and the Oscar. Now, speed advantage can be characterized in 3 ways: top level speed, top dive speed, and maximum climb rate. Now, a few fighters were really dominant in their little mini era, like the WWII in 1942, which had all 3 of those advantages simultaneously. In 1942, the F4 Wildcat had a dive speed advantage over the Mitsubishi Zero, which was its only advantage, and it turned out to be very important. And we're not just going to talk about planes, we're also going to talk about pilots. And pilots were arguably more important than fast fighter planes. And they were created primarily through excellent training and combat experience. With few exceptions, the force that had the best fighter pilots and the most effective fighter formations would get the upper hand. And of course, teamwork was really important. And we're also going to talk about dogfighting. Now, despite the importance of speed and surprise in the battle for World War II superiority, there were a lot of dogfights that didn't take place, and they could be decisive in many cases. This is my favorite subject. But I'm going to include some human factors that will hopefully take this away from a plane versus plane discussion and make it more of a pilot versus pilot discussion. So there's a couple things that are really important to keep in mind when you're talking about World War II fighter combat, and one of them is the weapons, guns. Guns were the only weapon that was really used in fighter versus fighter combat in World War II. Secondly, guns have very limited range. Because of this, the most effective defense was to simply stay out of range or get out of range of your enemy's guns. And that represented a clear advantage to faster fighters. And of course, shooting from out of range, like this guy, or shooting from just too far away to be effective, was the most common gunnery error in World War II. Now, a factor that's closely related was the fact that, unlike in the movies, you couldn't just clamp down on the trigger and shoot long bursts of fire without either damaging your guns or running out of ammo very quickly, which is why we're going to talk about the Spitfire Mark I. You remember the movie Dunkirk from a couple of years ago? And it seemed like the Spitfire pilots had like unlimited ammo supplying that thing. They're just shooting. In reality, that thing had about 15 seconds of continuous firepower. So you could shoot a 3-second burst 5 times, and then you're all done. You're out of ammo. Might as well go home. That's kind of a middle road example. There were some planes that had as much as about 30 seconds of continuous firepower. And on the extreme other end, there were fighters that only had about 6 seconds of firepower with their main guns, like the 20mm cannons in the early Spitfire Mark V or the Messerschmitt 109E are some good examples of that. Now, this is a World War II combat report, and if you read a lot of these, you're going to notice a common theme. If an impending attack was discovered and the element of surprise was gone, the most common evasive tactic was running away from the attacker, even when the defender was flying a plane known to be slower than the attacker. So you got to ask yourself why. Why would you do that? Why would you run away from a Thunderbolt if you're flying in a dive? You're flying something that you know is slower. Well, a lot of times it was with panic and fear, but also it just worked sometimes. It worked a lot because the attacker had to get very close, as we discussed before, and the closing speed could be kind of slow, maybe 10 to 20 miles an hour of closing speed. So at that rate, it takes a long time to get into guns range, and in the meantime, you might be able to find a cloud to hide in, find a buddy to come to the rescue. There's just a ton of reasons that you could get away. So it worked a lot, so people ran away a lot. In the meantime, the fleeing fighter, so there you go. just said all that. Another example is the attacker, a red-tailed hero up here in the corner, might have strict orders to just stay with bombers and only chase enemy fighters away. So in that case, there he is, he's doing his job, and when he's done, he may or may not get the kill. If he's chasing them away from the bombers, he'll just come right back into formation, and that kind of encourages that behavior too, doesn't it? If you start going after the bombers and they chase you away and then they give up, you're like, oh, I can get away with running. Now, so we're talking about surprise attacks, so it's super important. So how do you get yourself in a position for a surprise attack? It starts with careful, methodical, constant searching. You got to be looking around all the time, and it helps to have exceptionally sharp eyesight and a knack for seeing other planes in the sky. It was actually a common trait amongst the top fighter races in the war. The importance of being able to see your opponent first just can't be overemphasized, so it's absolutely vital to success or failure. Now, sometimes you might get help from radar, either ground-based or ship-based radar. The radar back then was kind of ballpark. It could get you in the vicinity of other aircraft, but it wasn't really precise enough in most cases to get you right next to them. So you really were still using your eyeballs to find the enemy. And you also wanted to look behind a lot, because you wanted to be the attacker, not the attackee. And once you found somebody to attack, the next thing was to get into firing position as soon as you can, hopefully without somebody seeing you coming. And attacking from out of the sun was one of the most common ways. That's you up in the sun there, trying to sneak up on your unsuspecting enemy. And altitude advantage was huge. It could be used to dramatically increase your closure rate or even to temporarily cancel the advantage of an opponent with better speed performance. It could also give you an energy advantage if a dogfight occurred. Now we're going to talk about gunnery. That's section 2 of the book. To make a gunnery attack, you need to intentionally move into very close proximity to another plane and almost collide with it before breaking off. It's kind of an unnatural act for most people, so it takes some practice to get good at that. Back then they called it a curve of pursuit. And they were encouraged, most people were encouraged to make mock attacks on friendly planes in their vicinity in training environments just to get practiced up at making a curve of pursuit. That wasn't always popular if you were the plane that was getting attacked. And of course, a lot of disputes that went on about that, but it was good training. And when you're closing in on another plane, you have 3 basic options: lead, pure, or lag pursuit. And pure pursuit was probably the most common, especially amongst rookies. It's not very effective. You have to have really excessive closure rate to be able to close on somebody if you're using pure pursuit and you're pointing right at them. And you might not be able to do that. So if you use lead pursuit by pointing your nose in front of the flight path of your enemy, you're going to close in a lot better. And even if you're flying a slower plane, if you do lead pursuit correctly, you might actually be able to close in anyway, even though you're slower. Now, as you close in on the target, you get really close like this guy, you might want to go to lag pursuit and start drifting back towards the 6 o'clock of your enemy to try to get behind him for one of those easy from behind shots. But it's also a good way to control closure. If you're coming in too fast, you can control your closure a little bit by using lag pursuit. Now, when you're attacking a fighter, it was always best to shoot from an angle off of less than about 30 degrees. Firing from greater angles required you to lead your target by a lot more, and it made it a lot more difficult to get hits. So let's see what it looks like from the gun sight point of view. This is a pretty typical World War II gun sight. That little tiny dot in the center is called the pipper, and that was zeroed on the 1G non-maneuvering gun impact point. The entire reticle was non-movable. It just was fixed in space, so that for that reason you had to estimate the amount of lead that you were going to use to hit a target that was maneuvering a little bit, or if you were just not lined up at exactly the right 6 o'clock angle on it. So look, we're going to do a quiz. This is a training exercise from it won't be graded. This is a training exercise from our Great British Gunnery Manual. And here we have 6 WWIIs in our sight. It's a pretty good day at the office. They're all in range, and they're all at an angle off of 30 degrees or less. Now, if you start shooting right now, can you tell which ones are going to get hit? Some of those are misses and some are hits. It's hard to tell. There it is. There's the answer. Those are the ones that are going to actually take the hits. Now what this demonstrates is that even this supposedly easy shot from less than 30 degrees angle off was actually not really that easy. I mean, let's look at this one here. That guy's up, it says here he's at 500 yards. I don't know why the Royal Air Force is advocating shots at 500 yards. That's way out there. But there he is at 500 yards. I mean, the point of this is that even if he was at 100 yards, he'd be in that same spot on the gun sight in order to get hits. It's just that he'd be about this big instead. Now it's better to get directly behind your target like this. These all look pretty good. But actually 3 of those are a miss. That is the correct sight picture for each of those. And if you look closely at these guys, you can see that they're just a little bit off of directly behind. That one you're directly behind. And that's one of the reasons, if you watch a lot of old camera film on YouTube, you can see somebody just pouring out shots at somebody from almost directly behind and they're not getting any hits. And it's a little puzzling. And it's because if you were just 5 degrees up, these are 5 degrees up, you had to have the sight gripper off by just a little bit in order to get hits. And there was a tendency to either not notice that or just not compensate for it in a combat situation. And so people would be sitting there, doing this and gunning like crazy, and they're missing these people. So that's pretty common. Alright, now this would also probably result in a miss. And most World War II gun sights did not have an inclinometer, and even if they did, you had to shift your focus from the inclinometer to the target and back, so that's really not a very effective way to use your eyes to shoot. You had to keep the ball in the center by feel when you were shooting. Especially at this longer range, that's probably a 300-yard shot. If you were that far out and you're skidding a little bit, you had a pretty high probability of missing, even though you're lined up perfectly. There's a method that just eliminates all of this junk and makes it a lot easier to get hits, and that's getting in close, like really close, like point-blank range close. And I remember that the gunnery exercise we just looked at, the sight in that actually is the equivalent of the inner ring of this gun sight. It's a really big U.S. Navy Mark 8 gun sight. That gives you an idea of how close this guy is. Now, of course, this had its pitfalls. If that zero blew up at that moment, he'd fly right through the debris, and there were actually a lot of pilots got killed by hitting the debris of their targets. But it was very popular, and a lot of people used it on all sides of the war, right from the very beginning of the war, because they knew that, you can hit anything easier if you're close, right? If you want to throw a rock at somebody, just get close to them, you'll hit them. In fact, this was the preferred method of Joe Foss, one of the top Marine aces. That's him right there. He's wondering why everybody doesn't do that way. Now, there was a guy named Norm Brown that flew in the Guadalcanal, and Norm said, "Joe, I'm going to go flying with you today because I want to see how you do it," because Joe was already known as a high-scoring ace at that time. So he went flying with him, and he watched Joe pull right into point-blank range on a zero and just exploded. In fact, Norm Brown almost got hit by the flying debris of that airplane. And when they got back to the base, he said, "Joe, you don't fight fair. You get so close to the zeros, it would be impossible for anybody to miss. Well, you actually leave powder burns on them." Now, the problem was not everybody could do that, and even Joe Foss couldn't always do it because he was flying a Wildcat. There he is lamenting the fact that his airplane isn't fast enough to get him that close every time. A much better way would be if you had a gun sight that would compute an aim point for you, so you could just put the pipper right on the target at any range, from minimum range all the way up to maximum range and at any angle off, like that. Now this is the sight image that Spitfire pilots started to see, because in early 1944, the British had developed a lead computing gun sight. And of course they gave us licensing rights, and we started producing our own version called the K-14. And by late 1944, most of the P-51s in Europe, and frankly all over the world, and most of the Thunderbolts had one of these in it. And by early 1945, the Navy had their own version, and they were putting in Corsairs and Hellcats as well. It was not fully automatic, but with a couple of minor manual pilot inputs, it could properly compute the correct amount of lead for even the most difficult shots. So we're going to explore how to do that. There were two reticles in this thing. The one on the left was fixed, and it was kind of like the older sights that just stayed in one place, and you could use it for strafing or board sighting the guns. The one on the right is the one that moved. When you look through the sight with both eyes open, they tended to combine it into one image. And when you started maneuvering, it would separate a little bit like this. Now here's how it was done. You would take this, you would use the span knob here to select the wingspan of your airplane, of your target airplane. So you're looking at your target. Now most of these things have labels on them. I would say, the bombers were usually listed in this area, and way over here on the right would be like ME-109 and FW-190 would be typically what you'd see, or here in the Pacific, some Japanese plane fighters. So you identify your target, you set a span using the span knob. And the second step was to use the twist grip on the throttle to adjust the size of the reticle. You can make it wider or smaller by twisting that twist grip. The idea was to use the stick and rudders and throttle to smoothly track your target while simultaneously adjusting this twist grip so that the diamonds would just exactly match the wingspan of your target. If you could track it for about 1 second, you put the pivot directly on and pull the trigger, and you were going to get hits. It required some practice and some smoothness to be proficient with this sight, but if used properly, it was devastatingly accurate. And it did wonders for the shooting accuracy of the average Allied pilot. In fact, it's one of the major reasons for the dominance of the P-51 during the final 6 months of the war in Europe. Now this is where I normally go into fighter formations. I'm going to cut that out today just to shorten things a little bit. Section 3 in the book is fighter formations, and read that if you want to find out about them. We can talk about fighter formations more in the Q&A if you want. But we're going to talk about dogfighting now because that's best. So I'm going to start with a quote from a guy that was a former Top Gun pilot. His name was John Cheshire. He said, quote, "It's who's in the cockpit and what happens in the air, not what's on paper that determines real-world results." Now, a good example of this happened over the Philippines in September of 1944. When, that is a Nakajima Ki-27, in case you've never seen one before. The Allies called it the Nate. It was a Japanese fighter that was a pre-World War II fighter, and they mainly used it in the 1930s. They were at war with China, and they used this primarily in that war. It was designed to be as maneuverable as possible. The Japanese philosophy at that time was to make the most maneuverable plane possible. On paper, it was significantly more maneuverable than any American fighter that flew in World War II. In September of 1944, this guy, Dave McCampbell, took on a Nate in a 1-versus-1 dogfight, and he was flying a Hellcat, and he won. Now, on paper, that would have been a folly of nearly suicidal proportions. But McCampbell was no dummy. He was a highly trained and experienced pre-World War II fighter pilot. He knew what he was getting into. He was also one of the most combat experienced and deadly fighter pilots in the Pacific at that time. He decided to give it a try, knowing that if he got in trouble, he could just use the speed performance of his Hellcat. If he timed it just right, he could use that performance and just dive out and get the heck out of the way. And in fact, after he shot down this Nate, he took on a second Nate, and that one kicked his butt right away, and he used his speed performance to get away. Now, he was flying a Hellcat that looked just like this one, which is now flying in California, in the CAF Southern California wing. His combat report, it read in part, quote, "After a couple of head-on runs at each other, I managed to beat him to the turn by turning sooner than he, and I worked onto his tail as he dove away. He was easily overtaken and set afire and crashed into the sea out of control." Now, to those of us who have experienced one, those words will sound like a flat scissors. Now, flat scissors looks like this. Again, after a couple of head-on runs at each other, I managed to beat him to the turn by turning sooner than he, and I worked my way into his tail as he dove away. Now, as it was often the case, by the time they got right about here, the Nate pilot knew that he was in deep trouble and he tried to run away. And unfortunately, that was the wrong move to make at that time. Now, it should be mentioned here that the flat scissors is specifically advantageous to the slower fighter and the fighter that can achieve a tighter turn radius, both for huge advantages for the Nate pilot. However, due to the very lopsided skill advantage owned by McCampbell, he was able to achieve a tighter turn radius in a flat scissors over a poorly flown Ki-27 Nate. Now that might make you ask yourself a couple of questions like, how and why could there be such a huge pilot disparity, as far as skill level disparity? And if it was a flat scissors, why didn't you just say that in the combat report? We're going to answer those questions. As to the pilot disparity, there was no Top Gun or any other formalized dogfighting school of any kind in any country at that time. If a World War II era fighter pilot got any training in dogfighting, it happened primarily by doing mock combat with friendly planes at or near their home base. There was a huge amount of variation in the level of time and energy that went into that. Some pilots got dozens or even hundreds of dogfights in practice before combat, and some got basically nothing at all, no practice at all. Now, there's also the matter of knowing your plane and being able to fly it to its absolute limits. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But as for the name flat scissors, although the word scissors does pop up occasionally in combat reports in that era, it wasn't formally attached to the maneuver, and it just wasn't used much. And in practice, there were plenty of pilots doing plenty of maneuvers that are now well known and named, but back then it was much less formal, and very few dogfighting maneuvers or concepts had been codified or named, or even put in training manuals or even formally taught. And one of the few dogfighting maneuvers that did have a name back then was the Loveberry. But the Loveberry can be kind of confusing because it has two meanings depending on context. The original Loveberry circle on the left was a defensive tactic developed in the First World War by a man named Raoul Loveberry. Basically, a large group of friendly fighters would form a circle, and then they would protect each other's tails. And if somebody tries to get on it, like this 109 is trying to get on the tail of that B-38, so the B-38 is next back in the circle, takes a shot at it. So it's pretty effective, but it's defensive. So it just wasn't used a lot. The other type of Loveberry which got its name from the first one, it was just a derivative name. That was when two or more enemy planes were chasing each other around in a circle, and that was called the Loveberry dogfight. And that was what now we tend to call that two-circle flow or nose-to-tail turns in modern terminology. The evidence from reading a lot of combat reports and memoirs indicates that that was pretty much the most common dogfight in World War II, usually close to the horizontal plane. Now, it's much more typical, like on the left, for the opposing planes to have misaligned turn circles, thus the modern name two-circle flow. Unlike the flat scissors, which is a turn radius contest that dogfight that McCampbell got in, two-circle flow is a turn rate contest. Each pilot is basically trying to get their nose of the airplane to move across the sky as quickly as they can in order to get behind the other one and get a shot. So let's look at what this looks like in the cockpit. We're going to get in a dogfight. So here you are, you're in a P-51D, and you're closing behind an FW-190 over there. You've moved into lag pursuit. You're going to see if you can get behind him for one of those easy shots from 6 o'clock. But he sees you coming, and he rolls into a tight bank to the right. But he's not going to run away, he wants to try to outturn you. So let's turn him. So you roll into a bank that matches his bank, and then you start hauling back on the stick in order to see if you can get a better turn rate and get him into your gun sight. Now if you're winning, it's going to look like this. He's getting closer and closer, and pretty soon you're going to get him down into your gun sight and you can start shooting. If you're losing the turn rate contest, he's going to start moving up away from the top of your flare shield. Eventually he'll go all the way around back there, and then you're in deep trouble. Now this is one of the areas where not only airplane capability, but pilot capability played a huge part in the outcome. If you've been in a lot of dogfights and really knew how to get the maximum from your bird, you have a pretty good chance here, especially if your opponent had way less experience. If he is good, it better be better. Now when you start bringing the stick back to increase your rate of turn, you're going to run into one of two limitations. You'll run into either your personal G limit, which is the physiological limit that varies from pilot to pilot, or you'll reach the critical angle of attack, stall. Now, it's a typical flight envelope for a World War II fighter. It's kind of generalized. Now, as the dogfight starts, if you have a lot of speed, we're diving into that dogfight. So we got a lot of speed. We're going to be up in here, so we're probably going to be G limited. So if both planes are about the same speed and they're both way up here above their corner speed, they're both G limited, and now you're in a G force contest with your opponent. And no matter what the turn rate capability of the individual aircraft, if they're both G limited, the person that can pull the most G is going to get the most rate of turn and is going to prevail. Now, if it's an auto of 1944 or later, as flying a P-51D, you're going to have a G suit on. This guy might be hard to see in the glare, but that guy's wearing a G suit, and that guy's wearing a G suit. of the time they actually covered them with a big coverall type flight suit so you couldn't see it. But I did find a couple of pictures of these. That was exclusive Allied technology from the autumn of 1944 all the way to the end of the war. And as you can imagine, it provided a huge advantage in that type of situation. In fact, the September 1944 combat report of high-scoring T-51 agent John England reads in part, quote, "Without the K-14 gun sight in my G-suit, I don't think I would have gotten it." In that case, it was a 109. Now, as the fight continues, you're going to keep pulling G, and your plane's probably going to slow down. Unless you're in a steep spiral, you're going to start slowing down and losing speed, and the speed will go back towards the accelerated stall line, so you'll run into the next limit, the stall buffet, right? Now, the stick is your angle of attack control. The farther you pull it back, the closer you're going to get to that thing. The ability of a World War II fighter pilot to get as close to that stall edge as possible without exceeding it was one of the more important dogfighting skills, and it only came through practice and experience. Here's a very important thing to consider in this, and that is that World War II fighters did not have a stall warning system. There was no stall warning, no angle of attack gauge, no stick shaker, no limiter, nothing. You had to be able to do it by feel. You had to feel when you were right on the ragged edge of that stall. Now notice pilots were notorious for not being willing or able to hold and find this aerodynamic limit. If your opponent could do it better, you might beat him. The other thing was there's a lot of variation in the accelerated stall characteristics of World War II fighters. Some of them gave plenty of warning in the form of buffeting or airframe buffeting. Some of them gave almost no warning at all, just whoop, you're stalled. Whoop. Now there's been a lot of debate about this, and these arguments are not new. In fact, even during the war, the debates were raging about individual planes. With one pilot saying, the P-51, it's really easy to accelerate, so like I also know what's going to happen. And other people were caught by surprise by it every time. Now, if you did a high G stall in a World War II fighter, it usually resulted in a really violent spin, and that could shake your opponent off, which that sounds good, but yeah, it sounds good, but it gives you a predictable flight path. So as you're coming out of the spin, your enemy might know where you are, or where you're about to be, and show up there and start gunning you. And there's an example of that actually in the book. Now, that needed to be avoided, obviously, spinning. Plus, it would just get rid of a whole lot of energy and altitude. Now, you probably heard that the P-51 was a very maneuverable fighter, that it could always upturn the 109 or the 190, and that's kind of, it's a popular legend about the P-51. They did very well in that respect. But despite the fact that it is my personal favorite plane, I'm going to call BS on that. In addition to a couple of factors I've already mentioned, like the G-suit and the K-14 gun sight, the dominance of the P-51 was primarily due to the skill level of the average P-51 pilot versus the skill level of the average German pilot in the late war period when these things were operating. Now, lots of evidence from combat reports would indicate that skillfully flown 109s and 190s, especially the ones that were not loaded down with extra gun pods and rockets and stuff like that, those could be a real threat to your average P-51 pilot. And this guy isn't even an average. He's one of the fighter aces. His name is Glendon Davis. And on March 8, 1944, Glendon Davis got in a dogfight with an FW-190, and they just kept going around and around and around in circles. He was absolutely stalemated. He could not get it. He could not upturn this FW-190. He put down some flaps. Didn't do any good. Just could not get in position for a shot. And in his combat report, he actually said the issue was very much in doubt. Now, this guy is John Meyer. In the race to be the top P-51 ace of the war, this guy came in second place, so he's pretty dang good. He got in the same situation with a 109. He was absolutely stalemated. He went around and around and around in circles, got some flaps down, just absolutely could not get this guy in his gun sight. Eventually he said to himself, if I keep doing this, I'm going to run out of gas. I got a long ways to go to get back to England. So he picked a moment, and he retracted flaps, dove to the deck, and he managed to outrun the thing. P-51 speed, right? Speed was important. And so he got away, and he flew back to base with a newfound respect for a certain German fighter pilot. Now the 109 is a very interesting case study in the fact that pilot skills can have on dogfighting. That's not well known today, but the 109 had automatic leading edge slats, which would automatically pop out at high angles of attack and give the pilot a little extra lift when he is approaching the aerodynamic limit of the wing. The slats were actually the outer portion of the wing, right? Up from the cross outward. Now these slats were designed to lower the stall speed in order to decrease touchdown speed on landing and shorten the landing roll while still retaining a small, low-drag wing for high-speed flight. It's kind of a design compromise. After the 109 started service in 1937, it did not take long for fighter pilots to start experimenting with using the slats in dogfights. And it took some practice and finesse to use them properly in high-G maneuvers. The reason is because they were not linked together. They were individual from side to side, and if you did not have the ball in the center when the slats came out, you'd get a really hard wing rock that kind of really startled people and throw off your aim and kind of screwed people up. So you had to have that ball in the center, and you weren't going to be like looking down to check the ball in a dogfight. Because in a dogfight, you're looking up there. Your opponent is there, or maybe there, or if you're doing really well, you might be there. But you don't want to be looking down to check the ball. You have to do that by feel. So you got to have some proficiency to do this right. In fact, this guy here, German fighter, is Erwin Lykoff. His quote is that, quote, many fresh young pilots thought they were pulling very tight turns even when the slats were closed against the wing. For us, the more experienced pilots, the maneuvering only started when the slats came out. And in addition to novice German pilots not knowing how to use the slats in a dogfight, the other type of pilot who generally got it wrong were Allied test pilots when captured 109s like this one. You know, they appreciate the fact that the slats were there for takeoff and landing, but they just didn't really have the time or the energy to spend on exploring them during dogfighting maneuvers. You know, they only had a couple of these things. They didn't have any spare parts. They were primarily interested in performance, and also considered the slats to be a nuisance during tight turns. Also out of the striding and the annoying effect of the slats popping out, unevenly and causing that violent wing rock just when they're getting the tightest part of the turn. So they kind of concluded that's not what they were from. They also concluded that because of that, that the B-51 could easily alter the measures for 109. If you ask any of these guys, that was not always the case. There's John Meyer on the upper left corner, and every one of these guys got in at least one really long, really difficult, very dangerous dogfight with a highly skilled German fighter flying a Messerschmitt 109. And any one of these would tell you that you couldn't always easily outturn the 109. So in summary, speed and firepower were dominant. It could be epitomized here by the Messerschmitt 262 jet fighter. It was 100 miles an hour faster than the B-51 roughly. It was the fastest and most heavily armed fighter in World War II, and we're frankly just really lucky the Germans did not have a lot more of them. Fighter gunnery, so fundamental for success and so difficult to achieve until the gyroscopic sights started coming out. What we didn't talk about is the Schwarm, the German formation called the Schwarm. That was the most imitated fighter formation of the whole war. It was revolutionary. They started with a pair. They discovered that the pair was better than flying in a formation of three. Then they eventually developed into two pairs flying together. And this thing, I mean, people flying in pairs, that's still in use today. So teamwork made the difference. And lastly, my favorite thing to say, pilots win dogfights, not planes. That was my inspiration there. Johnny Godfrey and Don Chantilly. And that's Robert S. Johnson, Hubert Zemke of Zemke Voltac, and Walker McKieran. Most people don't know how to say his name. Walker McKieran is his name. He has a very interesting career. So that's the website. There's a QR code for it. Q&A. It's going to be really hard to hear you with the helicopter, so if you got something to say, you might have to shout. Good. I want to thank everybody for coming out today. We got a lot more time than we usually do. I got this many of them today. I'm selling them for $49. They're also $49 on my website, plus a little shipping, $7 for shipping anywhere in the United States. And then it's also available on Amazon. Right now they're selling for $62 on Amazon. Yeah.
I'd like to know if anybody here is doing World War II comments.
Yeah, how many people in the crowd do World War II combat flight simulators on a regular basis?
Anybody fly combat
Combat pods, no?
Combat box.
Box, okay, yeah. I used to do that. I flew L2 Sturmovik a lot. Just really fun. Now I do most of my mock combat is in advanced RV4. So, if you read the introduction to the book, there's a group of guys. We're all highly trained professionals. I used to be an aerobatics instructor, and you know, we all wanted to be fighter pilots, and we all have our own individual rejection story. So we decided that we were going to not take no for an answer, and so we got a hold of the NATOPS manual, and we started adopting the Navy version of how to do this. So we trained ourselves very carefully and deliberately, and the adherence to the rules of engagement is absolutely fundamental, and we won't tolerate any unsafe flying. The objective is for everybody to come home with a smile on their face at the end of the day. But we do a lot of really fun flying. We do individual dogfights. I've now done more than 1,000 individual dogfights in fully aerobatic light airplanes. And we do red flag style missions, kind of with fighter escort and intercept and fighter sweeps and things like that. And I mean, wow, super fun.
You talk about tracers. I understand that pilots didn't use them, they weren't reactive.
Yeah, tracers were highly controversial during the war. There were, as you said, there were some pilots that did not use them at all and took the tracers out of their weapons, and that mostly had to do with the element of surprise. You know, we talked about how important surprise was. And if your first shots were not on target, the tracer would give away your position, and your target would start maneuvering, and now it's really hard to get any follow-on shots. So Francis Gabreski is a great example. He, early on, when he wasn't even an ace yet, he decided to remove all the tracer ammunition from his guns, and he was one of the first guys in Zemke's Wolfpack to do that. And he felt that contributed a lot to his success. And he was a classic hit and run type guy. He would come down in a high-speed dive in that Thunderbolt, and he would start firing actually from longer ranges because he had such a high closing speed. But it would give him a chance to do several bursts before he would close the minimum range. And by that time, there was usually nothing but a jump pile in front of him. Another guy was Tommy Lynch, who was one of the squadron commanders of the Pacific flying P-38s, and he actually said no one in the squadron is going to use tracers anymore. We're going to see if it does us any good. And they found that it was a lot more effective. Again, they were going against Japanese fighters that were very maneuverable, and they couldn't maneuver with them, so they had to do surprise attacks. So, and another thing that a lot of people really like tracers. If you were doing maneuvering combat and you were doing deflection shooting, you know, it kind of gave you a good idea where the rounds were going. Give you a sense of the time of flight of the bullets as well, which is why they're really good if you're doing gunnery training. You also want to have some tracer in there so you get a feel for the time of flight, which helps you with your heat estimation. But with the K-14 gun safety mode, you can put the pipper right on the target. There's no need for tracers anymore. And so when people start to use those, the tracers just went by the wayside.
Drop tanks. So the extended range, but were they able to use the fuel from the drop tanks first? Was it selectable when they used the fuel?
Yeah, drop tanks.
Because obviously they would drop them before they got into a combat situation or when they got into a combat situation.
That's right. You know, in fact, it's kind of funny. One of my pet peeves is seeing aviation, you know, beautifully executed aviation art on a plane in a dogfight that's carrying a drop tank. They drop them every time before they get started, but unless it was stuck, right? But yeah, so drop tanks were revolutionary. They were super important, and yeah, so fuel management was very important in a World War II fighter. You would typically start on internal fuel because there was a fuel return line coming off the engine that would fill a certain tank that would go back to a certain tank. And so you had to get a little room on the top of that tank, and you had more reliable fuel supply and internal fuel. But then right away you would switch to the drop tanks, and you could select them side to side. I asked a World War II fighter pilot one time, I said, how do you know how much fuel is in the tank? You just use your watch? You know, because there's no gauge on it. And he said, yeah, pretty much it was just timing. And then I said, well, okay, you were flying Thunderbolts a lot. I mean, you needed every drop of fuel from that drop tank. How did you get every drop of fuel out of it? And he said, well, what we do is we keep an eye. We knew when it was about to run out of gas. We would keep an eye on the fuel pressure gauge. When the fuel pressure gauge started to fluctuate, you knew it was just about out. You quick switch to an internal tank. They said, well, did you ever not notice? He goes, oh yeah. Then the engine would quit and just switch to an internal tank, and your wingman would be like, whoa, you know, trying to stay in formation with it. And that was about it. Yeah, but yeah, drop tank's huge.
I understand they have a warfighter too long.
Yeah. That was really common for people to be involved in a giant melee of 20, 30, 40, 50 planes going around in a big dogfight. And they get done with their opponent, whether it's destroyed or got away or whatever the case, and they look around and they can't see anybody. And that was such an amazingly common experience. It was just mystifying for even the pilots who were involved. And it really has to do with the fact that these airplanes are just traveling so fast. I mean, when you're watching the air show and you see a P-51, if it gets to the edge of the air show boundary, it's really hard to see. And it gets a little bit beyond that, it's gone. And you can travel a few miles in opposite directions and get away from each other pretty quickly. So that was basically what was going on.
Talk about the Thatch Weed.
Oh, the Thatch Weed, one of my favorite subjects. That's actually in the formation section that they left out here. Jimmy Thatch was, I think, one of the most brilliant pilots of World War II. In fact, he actually called it the beam defense position because he would never name a maneuver after himself. But yeah, what he did is he got intel. So they were flying Wildcats. The Wildcat at that time was a brand new, the latest and greatest thing that the Navy had. And he got an intel report from China about the Zero, and it had such high performance, he wasn't even considering maneuverability. He just read the performance numbers that they were estimating for this thing, and he was like, there's nothing we can do about this. How are we going to defend ourselves against this thing called the Zero? Well, he figured out that if they had two sections of two airplanes, put two over here and two over here, and they flew about a turn diameter apart, that if this section over here was under attack by an enemy fighter, this section would notice it, and they would start to turn towards this section. This section is, they're looking inward at each other, so this section sees them in a turn, and then also initiates a turn, and then when they met in the center, this section would be able to shoot at the person that's on the tail of the one section under attack, and then after they pass, then they go off and weed, and then they attain the original positions, but on the opposite side. If you kept going back and forth, you would weed. And so eventually it became known as the Thatch Weed. It was Jimmy Flatley, actually, if you've ever heard of him. He was another real famous early war Navy pilot. He was the guy that named it the Thatch Weed because he used it in combat in the battles of the Battle of Santa Cruz. He had 4 Wildcats in his whole division. 4 airplanes came back to the carrier, and it was under attack. They were almost out of ammo. Their carrier is right over there, and they can't go land on it. They're really low on fuel. And all of a sudden they started getting attacked by Zeros. So they just set out and started doing the beam defense position, also known as the Thatch Weed. And they sat there doing that for about a half an hour, not one of them took a hit. And he was so excited about it that he called it the Thatch Weed. And it also was kind of it was a foundational formation. The Navy developed 4 aircraft formations, kind of like the Swarm, but they did that individually without any influence from the Germans, and it was all Jimmy Thatch, and they called it division tactics. And because of that battle that Jimmy Flatley was in, they were able to develop these tactics and come out with a whole bunch of really cool training manuals and stuff. And it was all just in time for the Hellcat and the Corsair came out. So that Thatch Weed was hugely important.
Compare the Corsair with the P-51.
Or compare the Corsair with the P-51. Well, I love them both. Corsair was my original interest in aviation, in fact. You know, I hate to admit it, but I used to watch Black Sheep Squadron when I was a kid, you know, and I can't even watch it with the volume turned up now, you know. But that was a fun show. I mean, the Corsair, it was not quite as fast as the P-51. And sometimes I wonder, you know, how it would have done in Europe, because it was fast, but it was only just about as fast or a little faster than German fighters, so it would have struggled a little bit more, but it could turn really well. I mean, on paper dogfighter, it had a lower stall speed and a really good thrust-away ratio, so it probably would have done really well in dogfights with European fighters. Yeah, it kind of depends on what you're trying to do, you know.
Well, the British did use it, right? Was there ever any instance where the British F-42s came against them?
I don't know of any instance where the British F-42s came into contact with German fighters. It was unfortunate. I mean, maybe fortunate for the guys playing those things, but yeah, I mean, I don't know of any instances of that, which was, you know, that would have been kind of cool. In fact, they used a lot of it in the Pacific.
Yeah. Yeah. Many tactics like we did, I know the tactics for safe race
Our tactics against the zero, I mean, the zero, the Japanese were the only country that I know of to successfully use 3 aircraft fighter formations. They actually developed them in their work in China before the start of World War II. They called it the Shokai. And they had 3 fighters that were widely spaced, and they actually used them really well. The problem with 3 aircraft in a fighter formation is that you got 1 extra wingman, and that guy is always watching how he might collide with the other aircraft, he might get slung off the formation, and so it takes a lot of training to get that to work really well. And of course, pre-war, the pre-war Japanese pilots were, wow, they were just fantastic. They were really good dogfighters, they were really good at their tactics and flying the Shokai. But when they had a lot of heavy losses in 1942, the second generation of Japanese fighter pilots just weren't able to pull it off, and so they get separated really quickly in the middle of combat, and if you're an individual, you're going to get picked off. Interestingly enough, little known fact, the Japanese actually prefer to get around attacks, despite the fact that they emphasize maneuverability. The Japanese Navy doctrine for the zero pilots was to use hit and run attacks. And in fact, when Jimmy Thatch first tried out the Thatch Fleet in Battle of Midway, they were just lining up and doing hit and run attacks on it the whole time. And that was one of the reasons it worked really well.
Was anyone ever injured by the bullets falling out of the sky?
Oh yeah, that's something I'd really love to know. I'd like to know, like, if anybody was injured by falling drop tanks too. You know, he was wondering if people were injured by bullets falling out of the sky. You know, one thing is, if you're flying over your own territory, the Germans use self-destructive ammunition. Most of their guns have cannon. They really favor cannon ammunition because of the explosive rounds, which are a lot more effective at shooting down large aircraft like B-17s. But what they had a fuse in those things so that when they would fly, when they got to a range, it was 2 or 3 times their normal range, they would just explode. So it would just be debris falling down. But all those American 50 caliber and the British 20mm bullets are flying all over the place. There had to have been a lot of people that got at least injured by that stuff. And I think that was one of the reasons that if there was an air raid going on overhead, you were supposed to get to the shelter or hide somewhere, because who knows what kind of falling debris might be coming down, including airplanes themselves crashing into everything. So that's a pretty dangerous environment, even on the ground.
Did the Allies have better gasoline, like better octane gasoline?
Octane of gasoline, is that what it was? Yeah, the Allies, yeah, absolutely. Jimmy Doolittle was, Jimmy Doolittle is known for a lot of stuff. One of the things he's not well known for, but what was exceedingly important was his emphasis on developing high octane fuels right before World War II. And this was a huge advantage for the Allies. They were able to use a lot more manifold pressure in their engine because of these higher knock ratings of these higher octane fuels. And that was huge. For instance, the Russians, they were typically, I mean, their best fuels were maybe 87 octane, you know, so that would really limit the amount of manifold pressure they could use in the engines. That's pretty similar for the Germans. They were using a lot of synthetic fuel, and they did have some 90-ish octane fuels, but they were rare and hard to produce. So they would do things like, the Germans would do things like water methanol injection or nitrous oxide injection to help boost the engines so they can become competitive. But that adds a lot of weight and complexity to the airplane. So it's much better to just have a higher knock rating, like 150 grade fuel or something, which they eventually got into. P-51s were in Europe, were using 150 grade fuel from like right around D-Day, and after that, and that increased the power rating of the engine significantly. It was huge.
You mentioned that some of the best fighter pilots in the U.S. were not great deflection shooters. They were just pilots who got exposed.
Yeah.
Great deflection.
So he was saying that I was mentioning a lot of the great American pilots that were high-scoring shooters. And high-scoring pilots were close-in shooters, point-blank range shooters. But who were the great deflection shooters in the U.S.? Most of them were Navy pilots. The U.S. Navy put a huge emphasis on gunnery and gunnery training, like a lot more than any other service in any country in the Second World War. They had a real practical reason for this, and I talk about it a lot in the book. But Yeah, they got Dave McCampbell, the guy that got in that dogfight with that Dave. He was so good at deflection shooting that on his final gunnery training mission, he intentionally shot the cable that connected the toe sleeve that he was using as a target just to bust it off, just to prove that he could do it. And so he was that good. So there were a lot of those guys that could really put a bullet exactly where they wanted. There were some in the Army Air Force as well. I'm trying to think of who comes to mind. You know, one of my favorite stories about that is actually a British guy named Colin Gray. Colin Gray was the top fighter pilot from New Zealand, and in his memoir he talks about the fact that he just didn't really have much gunnery training, and he's out there in the Battle of Britain and Dunkirk, and he's trying to shoot at 109s and really tight turns. And at one point he just didn't have much time to think about it, so he allowed twice as much deflection allowance as he thought he should, and he hit the guy square right in the center. And he realized, oh, I've been under deflecting this whole time. So his method from then on out was just to estimate twice as much as he thought he would need, and he ended up shooting out 27 German planes and did really well.
Along the lines of pilot quality, can you rank the different actions and allies countries in terms of good, bad, worse?
Yeah, pilot quality and how it fluctuated through the war is a really fascinating subject, and it's super important as we're talking about high quality pilots were super important. In general, the Axis had the most high quality pilots at the end of the war, and some of the most inexperienced ones at the end of the war. And then the Allies was kind of the opposite. They had more of like the inexperienced people at the beginning of the war and the more experienced people at the end of the war. The Japanese were a really good example of that right at the beginning of the war. I mean, I think if you look at 1941, and you look at all the fighter pilots that existed in the world in 1941, it'd be really tough to be German and Japanese fighter pilots at that point. They were the best in the world, and they were already in the middle of 1941, converted motors that had shot down more than 100 enemy aircraft. You know, I mean, and in the middle of 1942, Herman Graf was the first person to shoot down more than 200. But by 2 years later, most of those high-scoring aces were gone. They were killed, or some of them were POWs, the lucky ones. Some of them were wounded really bad. Some of them were just so combat fatigued that they couldn't do it anymore. And they didn't have a lot of fuel. I think the Germans struggled with fuel throughout the war. And so they didn't have a lot of resources to spend training people. So they would end up, sending people into combat with just not enough experience to prevail or to even survive very quickly.
Is it true that the Japanese did track their individual kills?
Well, individual kills are a fascinating subject in and of itself, but regarding the Japanese, yeah, I mean, supposedly they didn't keep track of their individual kills, but there's kill tallies on almost all of them. So they kind of did, and I think it was more on an unofficial basis. It was supposed to belong to the unit rather than the individual. But there was a ton of overclaiming on all sides. So when you hear that somebody shot down X amount of planes, they may or may not have. That they may or may not have. They probably didn't shoot down quite as many planes as they claimed in almost every case. There's a book by John Lundstrom called the First Team in the Guadalcanal Campaign, and there were so few pilots and planes participating in some of those early missions in 1942 around Guadalcanal that he was able to link up in a lot of these battles who fought against who. And it's interesting because there were certain pilots, Jimmy Thatch was one of them, who actually probably shot down more airplanes than he claimed. And there was another guy, I won't name him, who's a Marine ace that flew at Guadalcanal, who's officially connected or credited with 6 air kills that may or may not have shot down none, maybe 1 or 2. And, there's just a lot of reasons for that to happen. And, I'm not placing any blame on the guy. There was evidence which suggests that he was maybe sharing a lot or shooting at the plane while somebody over there was shooting at it that was a lot closer and they would blow it up, and since he was shooting it and he didn't see that guy, he sees it blow up, he's like, oh my god. And it happened a lot. effective fighter that the Allies had? I mean, you could argue for a long time about that. That's a good. I mean, P-51 is generally considered one of the most effective Allied fighter, and there's a lot of reasons for that. We've talked about a lot of them today. I think I would go with that. If I was from the UK, I would definitely say the Spitfire. You know what I'm saying? That's the pilot, not the plane. You're absolutely right, sir. Yes. Yes. Well, thanks for getting noisy. Crowd's getting restless. Thanks for coming over.